Herbalists. I'm here at the Herbal Academy. I'm Heather Irvine, and I'm here to introduce you to some herb nerd words that our participants have been asking us some questions about. The first question that we've received is, what is an herbal category versus what is an herbal action? Aren't those the same thing? So one really simple way that we use the term categories is just the way it's used in gardening, whether a plant is culinary, medicinal, or ornamental. It's just as it sounds. So we have the many culinary herbs that you're used to from cooking, the medicinal ones that have a little bit more specific actions on the body, and then the ornamental ones. For example, if you didn't know all of the great things that rose or passion flower do, you might consider those ornamental. That's one way that we use the word categories. So another way that's kind of specific to herbal learning is the categories in the herbal continuum safety scale. So this is something that we use to describe the gentleness or potency of an herb. And it's a 5-part scale, with the most gentle herbs being number 1 and the most potent being 5. So 1 we call nourishing herbs. Category 2 we call nourishing tonics or nutritive tonics. Category 3 we call stimulating tonics. Category 4 are acute use herbs, so those have a really specific action. And then category 5 are what we call low-dose botanicals, and those mostly aren't used unless you're a really advanced practitioner, and they're used in really small doses. So those are some of the main ways we use categories, although categories can also refer to different categories of action. I'm going to talk a lot about actions just a little bit later on, but actions are as they sound. They describe how the herb acts on the body. So for example, you may have heard the term relaxing nervine or adaptogen in reference to herbs that we might use to help us, to help support us during stress. So another type of question we hear from herb learners often is, what are herbal energetics exactly? So the term energetics in herbalism can refer to 3 different things. We use it to refer to the type of action that an herb is expected to have on the body. Energetics can also be used to describe a condition or tissue state or sort of a situation in the body. And energetics can refer to an individual as well, which we often call their constitution. So to say a little bit more about this, for example, if we're talking about herbs, we often will call these energetic qualities properties. And we describe these often, so there are many different systems of categorizing energetics, but some commonalities are temperature, moisture, and tension or relaxation. So we use simple terms like cool or moist, tense or relaxed, dry, etc. So just for example, for some kind of obvious examples, we have ginger here. So this would be called a heating herb or warm herb, and it also is often considered dry. Now, sometimes it makes a little bit of a difference how the herb is cured as well. So a dry ginger root will be more drying, whereas fresh may be a little bit more moistening. But that's one that we can actually kind of experience when we taste the plant. Another one that is a little bit more obvious is marshmallow, or anything that we call demulcent. So these are moistening, and we might even say cooling. If we were to just wet this a little bit or make an infusion, you would see that it's really got a nice sort of like robust, round, soothing, moistening quality to it. And then another type of action, kind of contrasting moistening, is drying, which can be said of astringent herbs, although astringent herbs can also be used to describe or to give an example of tension or relaxation. So I have blackberry root, but you may also or be more familiar with something like black tea, that when you taste it makes your mouth feel a little bit tight and puckery. So that's that astringent action, and the contrast would be relaxed. Many different ways these terms can be used, not always just the opposite of what you experience from one of these herbs. So another way that we use this term energetics is for the conditions. So I'll use some a little bit more clear examples. If you get into our online materials, you'll see a lot more nuanced examples and explanations. But a sunburn or a fever, for example, would be a really obvious or a clear example of warm. And we are usually looking for herbs that have kind of the opposite energetic quality. especially when looking to kind of help a situation in the short term. So we all know that you might like to use aloe, something very cool and moist for a sunburn. You may even have an experience of using peppermint during a fever, which I would say I was quite surprised the first time I used it that way, even after learning it a long ways back, that it can have a bit of an immediate cooling effect on the body. We can also use these energetic terms to describe the nuance in a condition. So if someone tells you they have a cough, you might be interested in whether that cough is wet or dry, and then you can select from a range of herbs based on that information. The third way, again, that we use the term energetics is in reference to an individual's constitution. So many of the different herbal traditions or traditions that use herbalism have these sort of constitutional structures or philosophies. So TCM, Ayurveda, as well as Greek or Galenic herbalism. So I'll use the example of Ayurveda because that's pretty clear-cut when we're talking about constitutions. In Ayurveda, it's believed that we have sort of a constitution that we're born with, and that can be a little bit affected by our momentary situation, but mostly we have what we're born with. And people have certain tendencies towards things like heat for a Pitta constitution. If that's the case, they may experience more like redness, they may have great circulation, but they may experience inflammation, things of that nature. If someone is a little bit more cool and a little bit more of a water constitution as well, we may call that kapha, and that person may benefit a little bit more from warming and stimulating herbs. And then the third constitution in Ayurveda, vata, is one that's associated with air. And so this person may benefit much more from moistening and nourishing herbs, even for some of the same sort of situations or presentations as someone with a different constitution. And again, there's maybe a lot of new terms for you, so we have a lot of materials to help guide you through more of the meaning of constitutions and energetics. So here's a trickier question. What's the difference between an herbal property and an herbal action? Are those the same thing? So these two terms can kind of mean the same thing. So this is going to be a little bit tricky, but if we want to kind of separate them, we can think of actions, herbal actions, a little bit more like verbs, although they're not exactly, and we can think of herbal properties a little bit more like adjectives or describing words to describe the actions of the herbs. So I'll start with the actions because that might be a little bit more clear-cut. Actions are describing what sort of effect we expect the plant to have on the body. Mentioned previously, worth mentioning again. These are terms that you may be familiar with some of them, even from sort of conventional use. So examples of actions would be like expectorant, anti-inflammatory, demulcent, and so on. And then we have some that are a little bit more herbalism specific, like adaptogen or alterative, for example. So the action is describing what it does and what we expect it to do in the body. So the property, as a contrast, is sort of describing how it does that, or describing the action in more nuance sometimes. The property sometimes refers to energetics, like is it warming or cooling? And the property can separately sort of refer to like different groups of constituents, like bitter properties could be like a certain group of constituents that have a bitter taste and have a particular kind of action. So you may see properties used to describe like a set of constituents or chemicals in a plant that have action, but we're going to try to stick with contrasting action versus property as sort of terms describing like how the herb works or what it's doing. So as a few actions, we have astringent, for example. That's the action. The property might be considered drying or tense. We have also demulcent, mentioned earlier. So that's the action. The property might be moistening or even cool. We have lymphatic, so that refers to the action of sort of stimulating activity or circulation of the lymphatic system. And we have diuretic, a pretty clear-cut term that's also used conventionally, as well as expectorant. So those are telling us sort of like where the herb is going to go to, what kind of action it's having, what sort of outcome. But then we have these properties, which are a little bit more descriptors again. So hot and cold, warm and cool. We even have fun ones like diffusive or permanent. That means either that an herb has a very sort of short-term effect for diffusive or permanent for a longer-term effect. So we might think of expectorant herbs, and we might think about whether it's diffusive, going to just have an immediate action and then it's over, or permanent, have like a little bit longer term action. That would be the property, diffusive or permanent. And then some other qualities of the herbs can be called properties as well, like is it sweet or metallic? Is it bland? Is it neutral? Even things like resinous, which kind of describes like a group of constituents in the plant, but also, suggests, a sort of quality. Those are considered properties as well. So here's an interesting example of when a specific term could be considered an action or a property. So bitter, you may hear bitter used in reference to herbs. So bitter is kind of a property of an herb in that it's a way that we taste it and sort of even describes a set of constituents or a subset of constituents in the plant. But we also sometimes use bitter as an action to describe an effect of stimulating digestive motility, an action that we often get from plants that have the property or flavor of bitter. Another good word to play around with a little bit in understanding this is the term stimulant. So we could use stimulant as an action, and we do when we're referring to things that are like a definite stimulant, like the caffeine plants, for example, things that stimulate the central nervous system, get the heart going, and are really obviously have like a specific set of actions on the body and go to a specific, specific places in the body. But that word stimulant can also be used as a property, meaning that it's a little bit more on the activating side or perhaps like warming side, kind of no matter where it's used or applied. So the example would be rosemary, although it's not a caffeine herb and doesn't have stimulant constituents per se. If we use it topically or even internally, you may experience a little bit of kind of increased circulation or like a little bit of more stimulating than relaxant action, and that's a way that we would use the term as a property. One more example for actions versus properties. Say I was selecting an adaptogen for a person. So there are around a dozen different adaptogens that I like to use. So I might look at the person's energetic constitution, and although a whole variety of herbs may help balance their endocrine system and support them during stress, if they have an herb that matches their constitution, then when they taste it and when their body assimilates it, it may be just more agreeable to them in general. So if someone has a very dry constitution, for example, you would be wise to pick from the adaptogens that are moistening. Adaptogen would be the action, and then moist would be the property. Or likewise, you could choose an adaptogen that is a bit warming. For someone who has a cooler constitution, you may like to recommend an adaptogen to someone who could use one that's a little bit more on the relaxant side. So relaxant would be the property. Or a little bit more on the stimulant side, so stimulant would be the property. Do you see now how the properties are often kind of describing the action with a bit more nuance and character? So next and last question is, what are herbal tastes and flavors? In this case, we're not going to try to contrast the terms, just consider them synonyms. But we'll talk a little bit about their kind of use and meaning. as well as different types of tastes and flavors. So before reference materials on all this were widely available and before there was a lot of scientific testing, people relied on their senses to be able to detect and infer a little bit about what an herb might do in the body. We call this organoleptic testing. Interestingly, most of the herbal traditions use a principle of taste or flavors. For example, in Ayurveda, we have the 6 flavors. In TCM, we have 5. And because we're herb nerds, we have 9 today. So the first I'll mention is the flavor sour. This flavor can definitely often indicate that a plant has an astringent quality. These can stimulate digestion. Think about like the citruses or tamarind, for example. But also these herbs, many of them have some anti-inflammatory activity. They can be antioxidant. A lot are the really bright colored fruits. And some examples from herbalism: hawthorn berries and rose hips. The next flavor is bitter. And we've mentioned bitter a little bit. So bitter has one really clear-cut, definite action, which is stimulating digestion, both digestive secretions and digestive motility. Just tasting a bitter herb will have that action. So examples, dandelion, and any number of things like artichoke leaf or gentian, for example. Next flavor is sweet. It's a little bit more familiar from a culinary standpoint, but when we're talking about herbs, we are describing something that you might not immediately recognize as sweet. It's a little bit more like bland or earthy, or some of the more like kind of fibrous or rich, nourishing herbs. So these often have a moistening quality because of the polysaccharides that give both that kind of like bland, slightly sweet flavor and also give a mucilaginous or demulcent quality. Sometimes we call them nutritive. Some of these are adaptogenic, such as the many adaptogenic herbs that we use the roots of. Certainly we call them demulcents, and sometimes they're immunomodulant, and that is again due to those really complex polysaccharides. Astragalus root would be a great example. Licorice root as one that's a little bit more recognizable as sweet. We have salty. And again, salty doesn't necessarily mean something as obvious as from like culinary experience. Salty kind of also refers to mineral rich. So this doesn't necessarily refer to just sodium, but things like magnesium, iron-rich herbs, etc. Once you taste a lot more herbs and have a little bit more experience, with using some references as well as your senses, you get to recognize it a little bit more. So these often are attributed to having like a cooling and sometimes drying quality on the body, certainly nutritive, and nettle leaf is an example, as well as chickweed. Pungent is the next. This is one of the easier ones to conceptualize. It is what it sounds like, spicy herbs. These can be stimulating, at least to the circulation or on contact with the skin. They can be rubefacient. That's something that kind of brings blood to an area and improves circulation just locally. And these often have an affinity for the digestive system, can have temporary effects on the cardiovascular system, often in positive ways that we like. Sometimes in the respiratory system as well as kind of expectorants. And some would even suggest they might have a little bit of nervous system activity. So some classic examples: cayenne and oregano. Acrid. So this is a little bit a term you probably know but might not be as familiar with using. So acrid herbs have a kind of, like a sharp sensation and sometimes even irritating, as with lobelia, which is one of those low-dose herbs that I wouldn't recommend you use, but a little bit kind of just sharp to the taste. And some of these are analgesic or antispasmodic. An example would be kava, as well as having some other flavors in there like bitter. Kava's a bit acrid, black cohosh is a bit acrid, and California poppy, one that you may actually be using and trying, has just that kind of like sharp, even sort of metallic flavor when you first taste it. Astringent herbs. So this is one you're probably more familiar with. Tea, sort of underripe fruits have that astringency quality. And these tend to be drying on the body, but also have an action of kind of tightening tissue a little bit. the tissue that they come in contact with within the mouth and throughout the GI tract. We can also use astringents topically. Witch hazel and tea are some really classic familiar examples. And then one more is bland, which, you know, we mentioned how the taste sweet is a little bit bland, but bland is another one that's another flavor that's sometimes recognized as something that's even a little bit more neutral than sweet. So these are usually cooling in nature. They may also have like a demulcent or sort of slippery quality, and are certainly you know, often present in things like barks and roots. So bland and sweet are somewhat similar, but you'll see each of those different terms used depending on what herb is referred to, and also different sources will use, some will use one term or another. I hope that was helpful. As you can see, there are a lot of different nuances to how these herbal terms are used. If you're interested in learning more, definitely follow the channel. We're just getting started and we've got a lot of really cool lessons planned. And also you can navigate over to the Herbal Academy's page where we have a whole number of courses and a lot of free resources to enhance your herbal learning. Really thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to seeing you next time on Ask an Herbalist.